Welcome everybody. I guess I've got to start with an apology. Our data was accessed as a result of a breach. It wasn't a massive data set, but it still did contain some personal data. If you were affected by that, i.e. if your data was in that data set, you will already have been contacted to inform you of that. And I'm going to give some more sense of kind of really what happened on today's call. But I really want to start very clearly and say, we're really sorry that this has happened. But at the same time, when I was talking with my board about this, we thought this was an opportunity not just for us to have learning as an organization, but to share our learning with all of you. Because we kind of theoretically knew there was a risk here, but we probably didn't really think it would ever happen to us, and it has happened. And you might feel the same. In actual fact, let's share the results of the survey and see what that actually says. So we have very little protection and are very exposed to attack. 5% of people are saying that. We have limited protection, but have little of value to be attacked, a further 5%. We have some protection in place, but are still liable to attack, 60%. So that's the majority. We have pretty good protection and are unlikely to be breached, 31%. And no one thinks that they're kind of impervious, which is quite right, because no one is impervious to this. Obviously, even the GCHQ get hacked from time to time, although they'll probably never tell us about that, and I won't ask Cub to comment on that either. But no one is immune, and I think we all need to therefore be alert and aware of those risks. So let's move along. What I want to do today is give you a lot more of a sense of what actually really happened, because when I reflected on what it felt like to go through what was a pretty unpleasant experience, I realized that though I knew a lot of the theory, because I'd never experienced it or never actually had it described to me what actually happened, that my understanding wasn't as deep as I would have liked it to have been. So really what I'm aiming to do today is to give a lot more of that sense to all of you here, so that if you are ever in the unfortunate position that we found ourselves in, you may be better prepared for that. So that's my aim. Obviously, this is a little bit embarrassing for us because we've run loads of webinars on cybersecurity, and this has happened to us. But I think that just illustrates my point. It can happen to anyone. We've got some big learnings of things we need to do further as well. Obviously, we're going to look to strengthen our protection as a result of this experience, and we will share some of those things that we're going to be doing as well. I think there are two key things to always bear in mind, both before an attack and after an attack, and that's what are attackers after. The top thing they're all after is money. So either your money or your donors' money. And for us, as we don't have donors, but we do have business sponsors, they were after our sponsors' money. And I'll share a bit how that unpacked later on. They're also after personal data, because they want to either target the people with that data for fraud, or they want to just use that to perpetuate their next attack, so through phishing. I think those are the principal risks. There is a hacktivist risk as well, that people might want to undermine your cause by getting into your site, for example. But I think we generally see that less often. Money and data are probably the most common motivations overall. So what actually happened? I'm going to describe this in very simple terms. First of all, one of our email accounts was breached. We don't know for certain how this happened, but we think it's most likely that it was a phishing attack. You will all have seen these because they're endemic. If you don't have your spam filters on, you'll probably be getting multiple of these coming through a week. Good spam filters will cut down some of those, but some of them will still probably find their way to your inbox. And if you're on your mobile device, you probably see more of them hitting your mobile device than actually hit your desktop. So that's what we think happened, but we can't be certain. But I guess in a certain sense, once it's happened, it's how you kind of recover from that as well. What then happened once the account was accessed? Well, there were some unauthorized emails sent in the name of the person whose account was hacked. So basically, a mixture of fake emails and phishing emails were sent out. And some files were accessed from the account, and that's how the personal data was accessed. So most of our personal data is stored within systems, but some of the work we're doing sometimes around events, we end up downloading subsets of that data, and that's how they got into that. So this isn't data that was available outside the organization in any way at all. It was only accessible because they were able to get inside our organization through this account. So how did we discover the breach? I think some really good learnings in this, so I'm going to go through this in some detail. So the first thing that happened was that the email of one of our staff behaving oddly. I was actually talking to them on one of the days when this was happening, and they're saying to me, you know, my emails aren't going into my inbox, they're kind of popping up in some other folder. And I'm kind of like, I think you need to get that looked at. It doesn't really sound right. But I don't think either I nor them were sufficiently alarmed. It didn't sound right. So I was saying, get it looked at, but I wasn't like, stop everything you're doing, don't do anything else, get this looked at, which actually should have been the reaction, because that was the very first sign of the breach. And what was happening was that the attacker, once they'd got into the account, they set up inbox rules, because they start to do things from your account and they don't want you to see what they're doing. So they set up various diverts on the incoming emails, the delete signs of their actions as they go along. So if any of you, any of this, vital to take action immediately. The second sign was a phishing email that went out from the account. It went to me. There were actually 52 of these that were sent out. It went to me and it went to a number of other people as well. Because it was an internal mail, and it actually looked like an order from one of our partners. So this is great. So I clicked on it to open it because it didn't look like a phishing email. And actually our antivirus software sprang into action there and told me that that was a malicious link, which was great. You know, part of the system worked. I immediately emailed the person to go, hey, you know, I think you sent a dodgy link. Second mistake there. Because of the inbox rules, they never received that email. They never saw that. A little while later, and we're not talking a massive length of time later, the third sign was actually Cub was a recipient of this email as well. So Cub phoned me up and said, I think you've been hacked. And I'm like, right, okay. And I was actually I'd broken out of a meeting to take his call, luckily. And I was on a meeting with the person with the affected account, and with Siv, who's joining us here. So I'm kind of like, right, let's jump onto another side call and get onto this immediately and start to address it. So that was literally what happened. So I think big points for all of us as well, because literally 2 days later, I had an email from someone else who I knew, who I've worked with a malicious link on them. And the first thing I did was I messaged them. I both texted them and messaged them through LinkedIn, because I knew they wouldn't get an email saying, I think you've been hacked. And he was then able to report that immediately to his tech people. So if any of you ever get mails from people who you know, please do that, because you're doing that person a favor. And if you just email them back, they won't see it. So that's pointless. The other thing to do, and we did this, and if you get any of these dodgy looking emails, send it into report@phishing.gov.uk so that the National Cybersecurity Centre can try and extinguish it. They stamp these down and try and get those links taken down. So that's a little bit of the background. Cub. The third thing we did after discovering the breach was we obviously contacted you and asked you for help, your advice. So what did you say at that point?
Thanks, Jonathan. So, I mean, first off, I think I just kind of want to recognise that actually the transparency that you, as Charities Digital, are coming out with this incident is is quite remarkable. It's not something we see very often. I think, you know, you only have to look in the news to see how long some organisations have waited to come out and be really honest with their membership or their supporters or whatever it might be about a breach. And I think the speed in which Charities Digital have acted is really quite impressive. And I think that combined with the podcast that we did jointly with Jerry Crow, who I know is on the call today from Mary Stevens Hospice only a few weeks ago, is an example of kind of the way that the sector is hopefully moving to seeing this as not being something you need to hide away in the darkest depths and never tell anyone about. And I think this is a really important part. But to I suppose your question in terms of what did I advise, the first off is one of the things you said a second ago really resonates, which is that just emailing someone back and saying, I think you've been breached, probably will not alert them to the fact that they have been. It's likely that will end up being diverted by the person in their account. So that picking up a phone, thankfully, you know, in this case, I had Jonathan's mobile number. I picked up the phone to him and he answered, which, you know, was great. Obviously, if that hadn't happened, we'd have had to find another way of speaking to Charities Digital to report it. But there was some steps immediately after the breach, or that we kind of agreed that it definitely was a breach. It wasn't just that the staff member had sent out something by accident. The first off is locking down the accounts of the person who has been breached. And there's a really important bit here. The first off is, you'll have noticed we've not mentioned the name of the person whose account was breached. And that's primarily because this isn't their fault. This is so common that it is really important that people don't feel that they're being blamed personally for this kind of thing. And I know that's something Jonathan and I agree on sort of very closely, that this happens. It's about how we pick it up afterwards. But the first off is to lock out the account, so that if that account has been compromised, that can't spread any further. You've now almost contained the problem, and it's about how you remediate for it. But there's a couple of other steps to check. The first off is it worth spending a bit of time trying to work out what the extent of the breach is and how they've got in. So understanding how they've got in is quite useful in knowing what it is they're potentially trying to do on your systems. Second of which was to check that there's no rules been set up on the email account that was breached. As it transpires, as Jonathan has said, they had, and that's really important because they will set up rules that try and hide their tracks. So whether that's redirecting certain emails into folders as the person discovered, although they thought at the time that was just something odd. And, you know, we've all had odd things going on through the last 12 months. You know, I think trying to find normal in our email accounts and things like that over the last 12 months has been very difficult. Reset any credentials to any other systems. So just because it's the email account that's been compromised, don't assume that at that point it's the only one that's been compromised. So particularly if that person has access to finance systems, databases, things like that, get those account credentials reset and communicate the new credentials to someone through another means than on their email. Obviously, the last thing you want to do is pass those new credentials straight back to the attackers, because they will just go back in with the new credentials and start again. And then the last thing, and this sort of goes without saying really, but it's just encouraging the rest of the team to be really kind of vigilant and almost overly vigilant in some ways, reporting things that are actually just somebody's, you know, mistake or doing something slightly differently to normal, because what you think might just be someone acting a little bit strangely today, and that's a lot more you know, common, I think, while we're all working from home and we're not sitting 6 foot away from each other, where we can just turn around on our chairs and ask questions. But just asking everybody to be really vigilant and just report anything that they think looks outside of the normal. And that will sort of pick up on those things that Jonathan mentioned a second ago about, you know, things were moving around in my inbox in places I didn't think. And, you know, at first you just assume, well, that's just, you know, Outlook or Gmail or whatever it is being a bit odd. It's a bit of a glitch. Those things are the first signs potentially of something a bit more malicious. So those were the immediate steps to take. And I'm pleased to say that, you know, Jonathan and Siv were able to take those very quickly. And certainly the speed that they responded was brilliant.
Thanks, Cab. Yeah, it's definitely reiterating that being more vulnerable in the work from home environment, because probably if the strange email behaviors had happened and we'd all been in the office, we'd have just had a quick chat with Siv and said, can you have a quick look at this? And it would have been found quicker. Secondly, the phishing email, it would have been and the person in question sits beside me normally, and I just said, you know, you just sent me that, you know, we'd have been on to everything much quicker. So that just illustrates how it makes us more vulnerable, because it's harder to communicate. But let's keep moving along. So how did we rapidly assess the extent of the breach? Because this was a really, really important point. I'm going to ask Siv to come in and talk about this, because he drove this activity for us.
Hi everyone, thanks Jonathan. So as soon as we found out, as Cobb and Jonathan mentioned, what we did was to block and revoke all sessions the user had in play at that time. Now, it wasn't immediate. It takes 10, 15 minutes, sometimes even 30 minutes for all those sessions to be revoked. Once we did that, we analyzed the headers of the emails that were sent out, and the attackers were sending it from their own system. So we got an IP fix on some of the emails that went out. We then cross-checked those IP addresses in the Office 365 compliance console, which gives you a pretty good output, but it also gives you a whole bunch of other information. So you had to filter down by what kind of activity we're looking for. So one of the first activities was logins from unusual IPs. We had, the user had IP to start with, so we kind of took that out of the equation and then filtered through the others. Then we went ahead and looked at the inbox rules, which we immediately turned off when we found out these emails were going out. So we tried to figure out and zero in on the IP that set up the inbox rule, and we found that. We then cross-checked that IP with files being accessed, and then we found out some of the files. So it's not the company shared drivers, which people would know it as. This was mostly within the Office 365 portal. So recently accessed file from a person's OneDrive or a SharePoint. And there were 4 or 5 files which we identified that we went through. Whilst we were doing that, we also revoked other accounts. So in addition to the Office 365 account, which is the email account, we also have the password manager account and several of our other key systems. So at the very beginning, we revoked sessions of all of those, blocked all of those pretty much straight away. And then once we were comfortable that it has been contained, we kind of then enabled one access at a time with the password completely reset and multi-factor. What was interesting was multi-factor is enabled, was enabled as standard, but it was in a conditional way. So if it would only if the Office 365 system picked it up as an unusual activity, MFA was deployed. But in this instance, what they did was they actually used some of the IP addresses from the UK and around the same area geolocation as where the person's account who was compromised was. So Office 365 didn't pick that up as an unusual activity and deploy MFA. We've now since deployed MFA pretty much all through. The last action we did was in terms of looking through what the attackers had deleted. So when you normally delete stuff in your Outlook, it goes into a deleted folder, and then you can go into your deleted folder and empty that deleted folder. So these people have gone in and done that. So we then recovered all the items that they deleted and then formed a list of the people that they emailed. So we ran cross-checked that with the Office Exchange logs to see where the emails had gone out to, and drew up a list of all the people that had been emailed.
Helpful. What we're going to do now is we're actually going to do another poll, because I'm really interested as to how long all of you think someone might be in your systems before you realize they're there. I'll tell you how long it was for us as well, but I'm interested in your feedback on that. Okay, I think that's probably long enough. If we can display the results now, and I'll talk them through. So 17% of you think it'd be 24 hours. Within 24 hours, you'd realize. 39% say within 24 to 72 hours. 27% within 3 to 7 days, 9% within 7 to 14 days, and 9% over 14 days, which is really very interesting. And right, this is where I need to tell you what our experience was, because for us, it was 10 days, which when you think about it, is really, really shocking. And it's because they're in there doing things in the background. I think for the first few days, they didn't even set up any inbox rules. They were literally just snooping around. And then about 3 days in, they set up the inbox rules, and they took some actions at that time. And then only at the very end of the period, when they sent the phishing emails out from the account, did it become really clear to us what was going on. And at that point, they'd obviously already done some other things that they wanted to do. So I think there's a real point here that you're massively at risk over that time period. So it's super important to actually be able to contain that and try and understand it and try and limit it, the contagion. We use a system called Okta, which actually manages all of our passwords. And what it means is that you can let it set up the passwords for you, so they can be hard to crack passwords, and it'll store them for you. And therefore, it's very hard for an attacker to just go, well, I'll use that same password in multiple other systems and try and find my way in, because that generally doesn't happen. So I think that probably really helped us, the fact that we had that, because they were in the system for a long time, so they could have tried to access all types of other systems. Also, some of our more critical systems already had multi-factor authentication on them. So that's the background. But what was happening? So they were actually attacking us from the USA and Ethiopia simultaneously. We don't know if that was the same person, or whether that was the same person effectively using a VPN, or whether they were actually two people doing it in parallel. We've touched on these other points before, so I won't spend any more time on that. And the attachments. This was an issue, actually. So where files were shared through SharePoint internally, that was great. I mean, obviously they could still access them, but we could see that they could access them. What I was actually more worried about was files that might be attached to emails but weren't shared in SharePoint, because potentially those could be opened and accessed without us knowing about them. So we actually spent a lot of time going through the account after the event to say, well, were there any other attachments in that account that might have personal data in? And then we notified those people as well that they might be at risk. So those were all of our, so that's something about our learnings. Let's talk a bit more about the actions we did. So we took the view that speed was important. I kind of put myself in a position of how would I feel if I was one of the people whose data was accessed, or if I was sent a spam malicious email. And I've had many of these in actual fact, and it's really very, very rare that anybody actually contacts you to say this, which is disappointing. I took the view that we would immediately contact those 52 recipients and warn them that they had received this, and that they shouldn't click on the link within it. If they had clicked on the link, that they should immediately seek help and guidance, because there's a contagion effect for them. We did that literally the same day, because my view was the longer you leave it, the more likely is that somebody might have clicked on it and something bad might happen. So I didn't spend lots of time saying, what's the perfect communication? I just said, let's get a communication out so these people know about it. The next thing I did when I got a little bit more data, but still within 24 hours, was I briefed the board risk committee. We're lucky that we had set up a risk committee on the board. So I had a small group of people I could go to and say, right, this has happened. It's pretty bad. I want to talk to you about what we do about it. So we literally convened an emergency meeting within 24 hours, talked about the data breach and how we'd handle it. The board were very supportive and actually said, we need to be very transparent on this from the outset, and we need to actually try and use our experience to help the sector as a whole. We also talked about the importance of the ICO. Cupboard flagged the ICO to me. Because personal data was involved, there was a question of reporting to the ICO. So we spent a lot of time discussing that in that meeting as well. I'm going to talk a bit more detail about the whole ICO. So the first thing after talking to the board I did was I called up their hotline to discuss our situation. Jerry gave me confidence about doing this, because in his podcast he did with us in December, I know that he went through this as well. And just like him, my experience was very positive. They actively don't solicit any organization information. So you don't actually have to say, I don't want to tell you my organization. They deliberately don't ask you. They just ask you questions about what has happened to you, and use that to lead you to decide what to do. They don't tell you. So they don't say to you, oh, in my judgment, you have to report this or not. They just ask you some questions and they point you to their data breach form, which is very well structured, and actually completing that data breach form helps you think through how you should respond. But the interesting thing was the first two questions they asked about the data were, does it contain any healthcare information? The answer to that was no. Does it contain any healthcare information? No, which actually flagged to me what the highest priority concerns are. On the data breach form, it also asks about other classes of information as well. So did it contain passwords? No. Did it contain adoption information? All types of categories. The answer to all of those was no. You know, there was the only bits that were in that data was there was some contact information. So we had email addresses and some phone numbers. And then we had what I describe as organizational information. So what organization people worked for and what their title was. The process with the ICO takes you through assessing what is the risk of that data to those individuals involved. So we spent a lot of time thinking about this and discussed this further with the board. And the assessment was that this data couldn't easily be used to perpetuate a fraud on the individuals concerned. So that kind of moved it immediately down one ranking in the risk. I think for me, the main risk I was concerned about was because they were on a list we had, those people might be further phished. Well, phished, they hadn't been phished, but they might be phished in the future. And that was why we went out last week and actually with a formal email to all those people who were in that file to say, look, this has happened. The data isn't particularly sensitive, but there is particularly, we think, a risk of phishing. People might impersonate Charity Digital and try and approach you and get you to click on malicious links. So that was why we sent out a communication, which some of you will have received, of that extent, and saying, you know, links that we do publish will generally go back to either charitydigital.org.uk or to Charity Digital Exchange. Always hover over links before you click on them anyway. Kind of good practice that we should all do anyway, but maybe we don't do often enough. If you're on a mobile, you can actually view those links in preview as well. You don't actually have to click through to them. So that process with the ICO kind of helped us to think through all of those risk things and decide how we'd action them. Although in terms of reporting, because it came out as lower risk, we weren't under a mandatory obligation to report to them, but we decided we would voluntarily report and do that within the 72 hours they asked, kind of because it didn't seem to be a downside really. So I filled it in with all the details, sent it in. I've had a confirmation that they've received it. They haven't come back to me to say, you know, you need to do X, Y, and Z. But the fact that it's there and they can look at it means that if somebody looks at that and they're concerned about anything, they can prompt us and get us to take further actions, which I would view as potentially a good thing if they've spotted something we've missed, that they'd actually prompt us to do further actions. So the other actions we took overall, Siv, you're going to talk to this one, I think, again, aren't you?
Yeah, sure. So we've increased, as I said before, deployed a MFA as standard on all our users' accounts. Then Jonathan carried out a briefing board in terms of the actions that we were going to carry on taking. We did contact all the people that had been emailed, and we recovered to say, look, you might have potentially received such and such mail. Don't click on it, delete it. And if you need any advice, please feel free to contact us. We also checked most of the other accounts to see if there was any other activities from those IP addresses now that we had a bit more time to go through even further back. We've informed the banks. We informed them through their normal fraud line and also through our bank activities. We did come across one instance, one of the banks didn't want to take their reporting through the normal fraudulent lines. They sort of insisted that, you know, unless a transaction had occurred, it didn't matter to them. But we went through our bank and then they took it on board. And we are notified action fraud as a final step.
Thanks, Siv. Yeah, so we talked about potential fraud there. I'm going to just build that out a little bit more in terms of actually what happened. We actually discovered this a little bit later than I would have liked, and it's almost like one of the catches of the ICO process. So the ICO leads you with the whole 72-hour thing to be very focused on reporting to them. That meant that we were slower actually reviewing one of the risks, which was to us, because ICO is all about the risk of the individuals whose data we hold rather than about the risk to us in particular, and actually to some of our business partners as well. And this was the sting in the tail, because when we retrieved some of the deleted emails and started to investigate them in more detail, we found that the attacker had basically discovered some of our partners with invoices. They then went in and modified those invoices to put new bank details in, resent them to some of our partners and said, oh, look, this invoice is overdue now, could you pay it? And so when we discovered this was a huge concern. We realized this was about £30,000 at risk. £30,000, because we're a decent sized organization overall, wouldn't sink our organization, but you know, we don't aim to make a huge surplus at the end of the day. So that type of money could potentially take us from small surplus to deficit. So it is material to us as well. So this was of great concern, and it actually kicked off other activities we had to do. You know, we had to very quickly notify the recipients of those fraudulent modified invoices, ask them to hold payment, sent through to them confirmation that we hadn't changed our bank details, that they were the same as they had always been. And we also took an extra action to say, well, let's look at our other open invoices. We had no evidence these people had been contacted, but we then wrote to those people and said, look, we're not changing our bank account, and if we ever do, we will formally notify you in due course, you know, in advance. We won't just stick it on the bottom of an invoice with different details on. And I think for me, I mean, this is actually an organizational point that all of us should think about, and I've been talking with my finance department to say, you know, if we get an invoice through with different bank details on, we should always query it. And it's funny how these things overlap. We actually had one of these literally in the same time frame that we were working on this breach, and the company had a different name on it, even they had been taken over by another company. And when we were able to contact them and talk to them, we were able to anticipate to establish that they had changed their bank details. What they should have done was they should have formally written to us and said, you know, we're changing the name on our invoices, we're changing our bank, and then when the invoice came through sometime later, we wouldn't have been shocked. So all of us should query any of those changes of banks that we get if we think they're not properly notified, because actually, you know, I was thinking about this, you know, if our partner had paid to the wrong bank, whose liability is that? Well, technically they still owe me the money, so it's actually their loss, although, you know, we'd probably have to negotiate or work something out. But if you want to protect your organization from liabilities of other people's fake invoices, then you should always have those type of check the invoice bank changes as well. So that was a bit of a sting in a tail for us, very much, that we didn't spot early enough. I definitely encourage, you know, this is the theme of think about the money. They're after your money, not just your data, and the actions they might take to get it. And it is about trying to basically defraud. For many of you, it'd be defraud your donors, So we've got some other preventative actions in hand as well that we're taking now. So we're actually we're going to contact all our partners to advise them of future change of bank account procedures, just building on what I was talking about before, because I think we can be strengthened and safer there as well. We're undertaking further data protection training for all of our employees. We actually did an immediate briefing on our normal Monday morning meeting to kind of bring them up to speed, but we're going to have a deeper dive session with all of them to make sure they're both up on data protection and data security. We're checking the deployment of antivirus software on all machines. It should all be functioning fine on company charity owned machines. There is a risk on home devices, and sometimes people do use home devices, so we want to try and make sure those devices are equally well protected as well. I think Siv's already touched on this, considering broadening use of multi-factor authentication to other applications as well. We're reviewing our internal data storage, access and security policies. So the question here really is around spreadsheets that might have extracts of personal details on them. We certainly don't want those ever to be circulated internally as an attachment, because of the subject I've just said before. You have very little tracking of actions on those. I think, though, there are times when we still need to do this, so making sure we do that through SharePoint, so we've got full audit trail on access to that data, is really important, and actually considering broader use of further passwords as well. Obviously there is a first line anyway, so to get into the network to an account you have to get through that what is now two-factor authentication on all of our Office 365, but on particularly sensitive data, actually having a second layer at the spreadsheet level, I think, as well. But we're still reviewing that as well. We can take a little bit more time to consider that in detail. Blocking access from outside the UK unless specifically requested by staff. Now that can obviously be got around through a VPN, but it just gives a little bit of extra protection that might help sometimes. I certainly want to strengthen our inbound email scanning as well. You know, there are various products. I think the point here is the more we can put in place the tech that kind of reduces the number of these attacks that get through to our people. Our people are always going to be our last kind of point of capturing these, so we need them super well trained, not to click on the wrong types of things. But if people are hit with less, you know, if you're hit with 1,000 of these on a year, there's a high likelihood one of them might get you. If you're only hit with 5, you're far more likely to spot them and not be caught out. So actually strengthening the tech to filter more of these out in place is helpful. We're also looking to have what I'm going to call benign phishing. So you can engage organizations to send in phishing emails to you and monitor what's happened. I think Jerry talked about this in December. So to actually identify people who've maybe clicked on them and then to target those people for top-up training to make them more aware of the dangers. And finally, also a quarterly security review process, because I think, you know, the threat landscape is constantly changing, and therefore being more kind of on it and aware of those changes and putting in place new policies, procedures, protections is important. But I want to ask Cub to comment on this as well, because it'd be good to get his perspective of other types of preventive actions to consider.
So I think everything you've listed is really sensible. I know it's probably some of the more boring elements of this, but actually that policies and processes point is really important. So, you know, as probably most people can tell as we've gone through this, you've taken a fairly well structured and sort of thought through approach to your response to this incident. But one of the things we often see in cyber attacks that sort of come across our desk, or that we hear about, you know, in sessions like this and in the Q&As, is there are a lot of organizations don't have an incident response plan. Now, most organizations probably have a plan for what to do, you know, if the office floods or catches fire, or, you know, dare I say it, there's a worldwide pandemic. I don't know how many people had a full response plan ready for that in March last year, but most organizations have these response plans. A lot of organizations don't have a really thought through and actually exercised plan of what to do if there's a cybersecurity incident. And obviously you can't plan for absolutely every single eventuality, but you can put in place some really sensible, okay, these are the people in charge, these are the people that will take decisions. Little things like, okay, at what point do we inform the risk committee, as Jonathan did? What point do we inform the whole board? Almost give yourself a criteria of at what point do you reach out to the likes of the ICO, perhaps, you know, NCSC or Action Fraud. Those are really important. And I think also being mindful, probably, and this is something very difficult in terms of what you do preventatively, but one of the interesting things in all of this, I think, did this kick off on a Tuesday, Jonathan? No? It
was a Thursday. That was a real
Thursday. Yeah. So, you know, in some ways, that's still a pretty normal working day. The number of times I've seen cybersecurity incidents kick off at 4 o'clock on a Friday, very common, or ransomware being deployed at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. You know, it does happen, and criminals know when we're at work, and they also know when people are in much more of a rush to get out of the building, you know, virtual building in today's world. But, you know, people want to shut their laptops down at 4 o'clock. If something comes in and they're saying, can you quickly get this invoice paid? I really want to log off for the day, or the chief exec's already left for the day. Can you just process this? I'll get him or her to fill in the paperwork on Monday. People want to do that because they want to go home to their families. And criminals know that. That's, you know, sort of their bread and butter in terms of playing on people's fears. The fraud risk is really interesting. You know, from the perspective of NCSC, it's something that, like you say, your first thought was right data, but actually, particularly at this time of year, you know, we're approaching the end of most people's financial years. I know, you know, one of the reasons why initially I looked twice at the email that came to me that I then rung Jonathan about was because we had been having conversations about what our partnership and our plans look like for the next financial year. So actually, the email that came was not out of the blue, I wouldn't say. So, you know, considering those fraud risks, particularly with your partners, suppliers and things like that is really important. But I think everything you said there is absolutely right in terms of preventative actions. I would probably just say, you know, I wouldn't see that as a checklist that everybody should go away and do today. I think for anybody that's sitting here thinking, I'm not totally prepared for an incident like this, I would go away and probably look a little bit more holistically at your whole kind of IT structure. There's some great guidance on the NCSC website and that we've promoted through Charities Digital on other webinars about if you're a smaller charity, consider the 5 steps from the small charity guide. If you're perhaps a larger one, you might want to look at something like the board toolkit to just consider what your overall approach to cybersecurity is, and as part of that, how you would respond to an incident like this.
Thanks, Cub. Yeah, the Thursday afternoon wasn't a coincidence, because the time that it went out, that email, we were all just, the phishing email, we were all just, well, not all, but like half the organization was heading into a big meeting. We don't have that many of those meetings, but we think that person realized well, there was a better chance of us not being able to respond and warn people that this phishing had happened. And it did slow us down. You know, it did slow us down as much as it might have, because you called me. But yeah, I just underline that point. They do pick their times for some of these actions as well. Right, so sorry, we've done that one, haven't we? So nearly done now, and then we'll go to Q&A. So yeah, just kind of trying to wrap all of that up. You know, my mindset is to say I think we all need to assume, well, we will be attacked. You know, the phishing emails we all receive actually are attacking. So we all do have these all the time. Therefore, we need both technology and training to protect us. You know, let's try and filter out as much as we can, but we need well-trained employees as well as a point of further protection. And let's assume that, you know, some of those attacks will be successful. You know, maybe not today, tomorrow, next week, maybe not even this year or next year, but at some point, there's a high likelihood in our career that all of us will be in an organization that is going to be breached. So kind of thinking about, if you are breached, you know, how do you kind of limit how far they get in your system? So this is this, you know, the stuff about the unique passwords, use of multi-factor authentication on multiple systems, and how you're going to react really quickly to that, and who you're going to call and the support you're going to get. You know, to me, those are all really important points to have in your mindset. And if you are then breached, stay calm. You know, panic kind of compromises the ability to think clearly. So stay calm, and then work through systematically, you know, try and contain the breach. So, you know, get the system and the account offline, investigate what's happened, and then act on what you find, and communicate, you know, communicate to the board, communicate to other stakeholders, communicate to affected individuals. Use the ICO process positively. I found it a great help. It forced me to think this through in a very structured manner. Seek help and advice. And I think, you know, just bear in your mind all the time, what's the attacker thinking? You know, they're particularly thinking about your money and your data. So how do you protect those and try and preempt them? So those are my big takeaways. I hope if your data was in one of the files that were breached, you have a little bit more reassurance from what we've gone through today. As I said at the outset, I am sorry. If you weren't affected in that way, then I hope you've all got some learning as well, because, you know, unfortunately, we're all subject to these attacks. You know, some of the largest organizations in the country have been affected by this. You know, I was talking with one company the other day who told me they have a team of 30 people working in cybersecurity to sit on top of this. Okay, they're a larger organization, so they're going to have bigger attacks, therefore they need more sophisticated responses. So if you're a smaller organization, obviously you're not going to have 30 people on it, you won't have a sophisticated attack, but you're still subject to it. You know, you still get money from donors, people want to intercept that. You still have data about donors, people want that as well. So, you know, I don't think any of us should be complacent. But I want to open up for questions. That has taken quite a long time, which I apologize, but I did want to make sure that we were fully transparent, and we'll try and answer as many of those questions as we can. We will probably let it run over time as well, in order to ensure we do a good job of that. So Mimi, you're going to take us through the Q&A now.
Yes, we have had quite a few questions come in, and we have also had a lot of people say thank you for your honesty and sharing the story. So thank you, Jonathan, for doing that on our behalf. One first question, just to kickstart, Lawrence has made a great point about our acronyms that we've been using. So MFA is multi-factor authentication. If there's anything else that you're not sure on, please do let us know and we'll explain what that means. First question we've got is, how can you determine if someone has access to the system before they send emails or review the documents? What if they observe for a while? Which in this case we did have.
So if they're a lurker basically and haven't done anything, I mean, the first thing is to try and make sure through things like multi-factor authentication that it's harder for them to get in and lurk. You would be able to see this in your system logs if you went in and checked them. So this was, you know, just to be totally clear again, this was an Office 365 breach. It does produce really good logs actually. When, you know, I've never looked at them, you probably wouldn't expect that as a CEO anyway. But I was actually really impressed by how good the logs were, the amount of detail in them. I guess, you know, there's a question as to how much time should spend just looking at logs randomly, just to try and spot lurking. I don't know if there are tools that can do it automatically for you. Maybe Siv can comment on that.
What you can do, your end user training, you have several URLs. If you're with Office 365, there's a URL, mysignins.microsoft.com. if you browse to it as a user, you can see all the times the system knows that you've logged in. And if any of those stick out, it gives you a nice geolocation as well as the times. And if they don't ring a bell to you, then you should let your IT team know, listen, I don't think I've been in this location. It's particularly easy if it tells you that you've logged in from, I don't know, Hawaii or something, and you're in London while it's raining. So, other things you can do is there's several compliance reports that you can set up within Office 365 security consoles that you select the conditions, unusual login activity. You can specify different conditions like time, location, and that will prompt your systems administrator. There's been an unusual activity, and they can then go and investigate.
Brilliant, Siv. I'll steal those links from you after the webinar, and we'll share them with the resources as well, so people can access those.
Sure.
Maybe there's something on the chat as well. Thank you, Jamie at Peak Vision. This is very helpful. You can set up automated alerts around geolocation logins. So that would then tell you that actually if a new location has logged in as well. So good point there. Thanks, Jamie. Brilliant, thank you. I have two questions here which kind of link with one another. So Holly said, for those who you contacted about loss of data, is there anything they should be on the lookout for? And then Tristan's also asked, what benefit did the attacker get in the end? So I think they do marry up quite nicely there. So if you are able to answer those. Yeah. I mean, we didn't actually lose the data. It was just that data was accessed. So the attacker potentially knows your email address, they know who you work for, and they know your job title, and they might know your phone number if we held that. So we haven't lost that data, but they have accessed that, and therefore there is a risk that they might use that information to, and I think it's mainly around phishing, to send you a fraudulent email with maybe a dodgy link in to try and get you to do something. As I say, I don't think, because we don't deal with things that are financially related, it's not a massive risk. But let's follow this through and say, well, let's say you use the same password if you're logging onto your digital account as you use on your bank account or a more sensitive account. If they could harvest your password from us and then go and use it on other systems, then that could do you damage. Obviously, the best way to be safe there is actually don't have duplicate passwords in lots of different places. And one of the things I've been pleased to see more generally happening with a lot of the, I'll call them the consumer technology suppliers. So now if you go into your, if you're an Apple user, if you go into your keychain, it tells you all of your personal passwords that have been breached and where you have reused them on other sites, so you can change them. And Google are now doing the same with their password manager as well. So there are little tools to help you make yourself more safe. But if you did get a phishing email and you didn't click on it anyway, there'd be no risk. So that's why we assess down the level of risk here, because it actually required a number of bad things to happen together to actually cause a potential loss for an individual. Brilliant, Jonathan. And in this case, bank details weren't collected, were they, from any of the access? Okay, lovely. So that puts Yvette's worry to rest. Paresh wanted to ask, when we sent the email out to the 52 spam recipients, did we then follow up with a phone call? Is that something you'd recommend? We didn't. There's a number of reasons for this, actually. One of the reasons is we actually don't hold phone numbers for a lot of those people. So much communication is actually done nowadays through, we jump on Zoom or Teams calls with people, emails, things like that. So it's not actually possible for us to contact most of those people in that way. Some of them actually weren't delivered as well, and we actually took the view that if those weren't delivered, probably the original email wasn't delivered either. So that's kind of how we've done that. If more generally, they're a charity digital subscriber anyway, so they're on our mailing list, they'll have actually picked up the second wave of communications, because even people whose data wasn't accessed in any way or ever in any risk of being accessed have all been notified that the breach happened, because we've kind of taken the view of belt and braces here, tell everybody on the basis that way even if they've not got to them through one of our other communications mechanisms, we might get to them through that way.
Yeah, brilliant. So we've got a question from Chris here who's asked for any additional tips for charities that don't have physical offices. All volunteers use their own IT, so we don't have a charity-wide network. We simply have charity domain emails hosted by a website host and separate cloud server for document storage.
I think this is one for Cub.
I think so.
Thanks, everybody. So first off, I mean, I think that's a really common circumstance to find yourself in as particularly a small charity. I definitely, just as an overarching comment, suggest having a look at the small charity guide. It's literally written for this exact scenario. What I would say is there is likely to be a multi-factor authentication option available for those email provision and cloud services that you do subscribe to. So I would definitely encourage finding out if that's available and where it is possible to turn that on. There will probably be a little bit of a learning curve for your volunteers to get used to that. And as Jonathan and Siv have said, you can make it conditional. So only perhaps if somebody tries to log in from a different location or maybe even a different country, which is probably even less likely for most of your volunteers, it will only trigger the multi-factor authentication in those circumstances. So it won't be administratively too onerous for them. In general, though, I think, there's not a lot that can be gained by the attacker from just those two systems. Obviously, it will depend on how much data you're processing. But I would also just consider, without knowing the details of exactly the charity that you're kind of speaking from today, just consider the types of data that you're holding on those two different places, so across the email accounts and on the cloud service. If, for example, as Jonathan alluded to from the ICO report, there's anything like medical data or I think even adoption data was quoted as one of them, or storing anything to do with passwords on those, you'll want to look at putting in place some additional security measures and may even want to contact the cloud service provider to see if there are any bespoke solutions they provide for those kinds of circumstances. Your typical kind of normal subscription, say Dropbox or Amazon Web Services or Google Drive or something like that, isn't really intended for those kind of particularly sensitive bits of data. But there are often sort of additional ways that you can secure it, but it will sort of create an administrative overhead in that space. So definitely have a look at the small charity guide and try and turn on multi-factor authentication if that's available.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cab. I think this one's going to be more suited to you also. What strategies would you recommend to reduce the surface area of an attack? Siv mentioned you altered your MFA policy to be universal rather than conditional. Some popular email providers make it really easy to set mail transport rules to prevent auto forwarding of email. Are there any other basic strategies we should be looking at to reduce the most common threats?
So those are both absolutely sensible. I think where you have the option to turn off email forwarding rules or just rules in general on inboxes, that's quite useful. Now, I actually personally have a whole lot of rules set up on my work inbox, but they're all about the way incoming emails go into certain boxes, and it doesn't apply to anything going externally. So that is blocked. So my work has specifically blocked things from going externally and that being created by rules. So that's something you can do, because I know a lot of people do find those easy. It helps me filter the different packages of work that I do. So they're not a completely bad thing. Don't just sort of sit there wondering why email providers still have rules if they're solely used by criminals. They do have a use. The other thing I would say around surface area is, particularly around things like databases, you want to operate at a concept of least privilege. And by least privilege, we mean giving people the least amount of privileges to data that they need to be able to do their job. So, for example, people working in the finance team will obviously need access to the finance system. Mimi, in your role, kind of doing events and kind of coordinating that side of things, you probably don't need the same access to the finance systems as they do. And the same can be said across databases of perhaps supporters or beneficiaries. Only allowing people to have access to the information that they need to do their job, and therefore, in sort of technical terms, almost segmenting or compartmentalizing the data and the information you hold, is a really sensible way to kind of limit the potential footprint that they could get across by compromising one or more people's accounts. the one thing within that is difficult, and often sort of people come back to say, is what about something called global admins? So those people who have access across everything because they need to be able to have sight of all of the data that's held or all of the systems that you're working on. What I would say in those circumstances is it is really important that those people are exceptionally vigilant, and they tend to be because they're the IT people typically. I'm looking at Siv here and hoping he's nodding along. Make sure they're being super vigilant, but also having the strongest forms of multi-factor authentication on those people's accounts. There was last year a really horrible ransomware that originated with somebody gaining remote access into a global admin's account, and therefore being able to deploy ransomware across the whole network. And that is something they will look for. Those global admins are the sort of the cream of the crop, if you like, for what criminals are looking for. So yeah, but those are kind of a few suggestions, but definitely there is some more specific guidance if people want to look for it on the NCSC website. We can point to it after this webinar.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cab. Just want to let everyone know that we have reached the 2 o'clock mark. I am going to keep hold of these speakers though and continue answering your questions. So if you can stay on the line, please do. If not, don't worry about it. It will all be in the recording. And thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day. A question here from Jamie. Do you have, or does the ICO publish how to risk access the personal data? It'd be good to have that work done prior to a data breach and from part of our internal risk assessment.
Yeah, that's a really good question. They don't really, or if they do, I didn't really find it. So I think it was just a matter of us looking at the different categories of data, because they do take you through this process of, you know, what were the categories of data, and then you have to think about what is the risk to the individual of that data having been accessed. And I guess we applied our thinking, our common sense to that, rather than kind of any formal approach. I almost think that they kind of want you to engage your brain and think about that rather than make it too mechanistic, because if it's too mechanistic, people might say, well, we went through it and they said it was low, and they actually missed something really significant. So that's what I suspect. I don't know if Cub can add to that at all.
So it's probably not entirely relevant, but there is a section on the website for the ICO called Data Protection Impact Assessments. And these are kind of, I think, as I understand it, and I will admit it's been a while since I've gone into the details of GDPR, although we are going to do a session on this at the conference in March. So I really need to get my head back around it. The data protection impact assessments are primarily around where you're starting a new project or a new initiative or something like that, and looking at from the beginning the types of data you're likely to need to process, control, store, or you know, and then subsequently the risk associated with that kind of data. That's a really useful thing, and I think the concept and the templates they provide can definitely be applied organizationally, particularly in smaller organizations where that kind of you're not necessarily looking at data along multiple strands. You may only have sort of one set of data. They can be used in that respect. But I think probably, and this is maybe one of the things we'll talk about at the conference in March, a lot of people did these data protection impact assessments back in 2018 when DPA legislation was coming in. Probably they haven't been revisited since then, and you know, the fact that I've kind of forgotten a lot of the key points around the impact assessments probably speaks to the fact that if I haven't remembered the details, a lot of people won't either. So
brilliant, that's helpful though. This actually links quite nicely onto the next question from Jamie, where they've asked any recommendations on data protection training. Currently they do this in-house and offer off-the-shelf training. It's often poor/tick box style. They've also gone on to say that they have rolled out the NCSC safer data training as their baseline InfoSec training. So obviously, besides attending your session at the conference, is there anything else that you can recommend there?
There isn't any specifics I can recommend, I'm afraid, unfortunately, because of sort of government's our ability not to recommend specific suppliers. But that was really interesting that somebody has implemented our kind of top tips for staff training. I'm really pleased to say that will actually be rejuvenated and relaunched in the new financial year, which is really exciting. It's just being redeveloped at the moment. So that is, I would hope, a really good place to start. That will be going out. We'll make sure, obviously, Charities Digital get the links to that so it can be promoted in due course as well. I'm afraid I'm not sure of any specific suppliers or kind of really jazzy training or sessions that you can send your staff on, but maybe that's something that we can look into for maybe future opportunities for Charities Digital. Right.
Lovely, thank you, Cab. Jonathan, going back to the breach that happened with us, we have a question here from Bob who's saying, was the initial breached email account already linked into internal banking and financial systems, or was it mostly related to emails with attached files?
Yeah, good question, and that's actually hinted at another action we're going to take. It was about attachments here. So we use Zero as our finance system, and it produces nice invoices with PDF attachments, and they can be sent directly from the finance system directly to the recipient and copied into yourself. It's quite useful to know it's really gone, that you set up the copy into yourself, but I think that then opens up an immediate danger, that if that is then hanging around on your account and somebody has a breach like this, then they go in and they start to modify it, which is exactly what happened here. So going forward, I think our process here should be, the invoices have to be sent just from the account, the bank account, and we advise people that will be where invoices come from, and that we don't hold any copies on other accounts, because it exposes us to an unnecessary risk.
Lovely, thank you. Bob's also said that we mentioned a subset of data. Did we mean spreadsheets? And that links quite nicely with Vicky's question, asking if our spreadsheets were password protected.
So yes, I was talking about spreadsheets. Spreadsheets in question, because they were internal, were not further password protected, because they're obviously protected by the account access, and therefore that's one of the things that we're looking at further, to say, what are the circumstances in which a spreadsheet should be further password protected. Obviously, if every single spreadsheet you have is password protected, then that kind of adds a further layer of activity that you have to do to get into that. So you probably don't want to do it all the time, but I think for certain sensitive data that is appropriate. So that's what we're looking at further.
Thank you. Tristan has asked, says that it sounds like we were using a cloud-based file storage. So is this how they were able to access files? And do we know whether they changed details within those files?
So yeah, I mean, this kind of goes back to there are two types of files. There are files which effectively are stored in, because we're talking about Office 365 here, if they're shared as a share rather than an attachment, it stores them on your OneDrive and treats it effectively as SharePoint. So that's a cloud-based storage. The other type of sharing is when people actually do it as an attachment to an email. And as I mentioned earlier on, we're far more worried actually about the things that are attachments on emails, because they're untrackable, or at least we haven't found out how to track them yet. Whereas there's this lovely audit trail of who accessed what file within SharePoint. And we don't believe that any of the data of those files within SharePoint was changed. The ones that were changed were copies of invoices, which were PDF attachments. And that's why it took us longer to find those, because they didn't show on any of the logs. It was only when we retrieved the deleted emails and looked at them, we said, this looks dodgy. We obviously had to open the attachment for that, which was a cause of concern in itself. Like, has that attachment got a virus in it? So we had to scan that before we opened them up. But we went through all of that and found the attempted fraud.
Thank you. Siv, Tim has asked you to repeat what the console was that you mentioned, if you're able to share that information, and we can pop that in the resources afterwards as well.
Yeah, sure. It's search and compliance. I'll put the exact URL at the end of this.
Lovely,
webinar.
thank you. And that did that help us know what had been accessed, and everything along those lines?
Yes, it did, and it's got a fairly well console that you can select by time, what logs you want to search for, which user you want to search for, what type of activity you want to search for. So you can use that information cross-check with. If you suspect an IP, you can put it in there and get it to do a search for it.
Brilliant.
The exact URL is protection.office.com.
Okay, perfect. We'll add that to the resources at the end. Thank you so much. Nina has asked, would you need to report this data breach to the Charities Commission in a serious incident, or would reporting to the ICO change this?
Yeah, we did actually discuss this both with the risk committee and validated it further with the full board when we had the update with them a week later. We decided it didn't constitute a serious incident because I think the formal definition by memory is around kind of serious damage to the organization, and we assessed that we didn't believe we'd lost any financial money, and because we'd assessed the risk and it had been low on the data, that therefore didn't constitute something that was notifiable to the Charity Commission.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. We have a couple of people asking us if we can share a template of an incident response plan for cybersecurity incidents. I'm not sure if either Jonathan or Cub have something that they are happy to share.
Cub, you probably got something that's really very nice. Ours was pretty rudimentary, like here's a list of actions we need to do.
Yeah, what I can probably share is a piece of guidance that helps you draft your own. It's really difficult to kind of come up with a template for that, and I think it would probably potentially steer people down a very narrow path by having the template. But we do have a piece of guidance. I'll put 2 links out after the webinar through Umimi, to one for smaller organizations and then a more sort of perhaps larger enterprise kind of organization sized one, and we'll also make available the link to Exercise in a Box, which is our free to use exercising tools. You can do tabletop exercises for different scenarios, of which I'm pleased to say both of the kind of angles of this breach fall within those exercises that you can do, so we'll make that available as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Jonathan, you mentioned that no financial information was accessed or breached, but we have an anonymous attendee here asking, surely if invoices were changed which contained bank details accounts, then it's not completely accurate? Or are we saying that only those that were accessed were outbound invoices, not inbound invoices?
Okay, so I should clarify what I meant. I meant no personal financial information was accessed. So we were looking at this from the data protection regulations and the risk to individuals. So the information that was accessed and changed was actually our corporate information. So it was corporate risk, not individual risk.
Brilliant. Thank you for clarifying that. We have a attendee here who says that they are on WordPress and get multiple attacks every day. Can we provide any comments on website breaches?
I'll do a brief comment and then I'll actually pass to see if you might want to add to this, because we actually migrated last year, some of you might be aware, from our old Charity Digital News website, which was based on WordPress, and we migrated to a new system called Afino, which is a kind of a dedicated publishing platform. And we did that because we felt it was a better, more suitable platform for what we do as an organization. One of the things that happened that we saw when we had that old WordPress site was various attacks at different points in time. And what I think happens in the WordPress world is that there are lots and lots of plugins that get deployed into your site to kind of fulfill various functions. You know, whoever builds your website will have used those. Those plugins all have to be individually updated all of the time, because the people who've developed those plugins are responding to security vulnerabilities. So if you are not all over your website in terms of maintaining those updates, then WordPress does have certain vulnerabilities within it. One of the therefore benefits I feel we have, and it was a conscious decision behind our movement to this platform, was that we've effectively outsourced that to our supplier who has developed this publishing platform to maintain the security and integrity of that platform. And we don't have to think about doing that ourselves, because we don't have a huge technical department at the end of the day. But Siv, do you want to add anything further about WordPress?
Yeah, I'd pretty much echo what you said. And in terms of, there are known vulnerabilities within WordPress and all the plugins that you might have deployed on your instance of it. So you'll need to go through and list those out and see if you're plugged in for those. And in terms of not system related as such, but like common login URLs, you would want to change those. So you wouldn't want to have WPA admin / at the end of your website, which then gives it access to it. And restrict access to those kind of sensitive login pages, anything sensitive really to a static IP within your organization. If that's not possible, then you want to really be having MFA enabled as usual with all the others.
Brilliant, thank you. Tony's also added in the comments to check out WordFence plugin and watch their security videos. So thank you, Tony, for that recommendation. We've got another question here saying it is recommended to send passwords separately from password protected documents, so in 2 separate emails, if you need to share them to a third party. Does this not really work against the hackers? What do you recommend?
No, definitely doesn't work, because if they've compromised the email, then they're going to see it. So this is a really super important point, actually, which is to say, if you are sharing data outside your organization and it's password protected, which is what we want, that's great. Do please password protect it, but send the password through a separate channel. So my preferred channel for that is actually something like WhatsApp, which is pretty well encrypted. It could be a text even, because it's separate. If we're doing it internally, we use Teams for that sometimes. Although if they've got into an Office 365 account, they would get potential access to the Teams as well. So it's worth trying to separate out and always send the password through a separate independent channel and not through the same email channel.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Matt has asked if we can describe more around what vulnerability may have exploited to the access of the original email account. They've also said thank you for the webinar and that's been very informative. I think you have covered quite a lot, but is there anything else that you want to?
No, I mean, we really tried to work this out. We couldn't see in the logs anything that gave it away. You know, we were trying to say, well, had the password been harvested through a public network? And at one point I thought that might be the case, but as we reflected more on it, we kind of realized that, you know, actually employees are spending very little time on public networks at the moment because they're mainly at home, and that actually the nature of some of the phishing attacks that come in, which, you know, they often use the names of big tech companies, and we work with most of these big tech companies, which is why I think we're kind of potentially vulnerable to those internally, and need to be on our guard more, and that's why we're kind of stepping up our own level of internal training here to try and make sure we're more protected, because phishing does seem like the main vulnerability.
I think just 2 things in that space. The first of which is, I think, probably don't think vulnerability in terms of what you think about vulnerability in terms of unpacked software. The most likely, and I'm like Jonathan says, we're not 100% sure how this came in. The most likely is that somebody will receive an email that says, you know, you need to reset your Office 365 password. Click here, you enter your current username and password, and then suddenly the form just stops, and you think, oh, that was weird, right? Probably the internet dropped out or something like that. What that quite often is that was probably a cyber criminal who has now just got hold of your username and password. They will then go and try and log in remotely into your system, and it's genuinely as simple as that. I'm not suggesting anyone tries it, but it is as simple as that, and that is probably the most likely way in the majority of circumstances. I did just see on the chat somebody just suggested have I been pwned, which is a really, really useful tool. We'll make the link available afterwards. You can set up alerts for your email domain, so at charitiesdigital.org or at ncsc.gov.uk, whatever your email domain is, and you'll be sent alerts whenever any of those people's email address or password appears in a breached data set that gets uploaded onto Have I Been Pwned. It's a really useful service. It's free to use. It's something NCSC is really pleased to recommend as well. We don't recommend a lot of things, but obviously it's a completely free service. So please do have a look at that. I've done it for my personal email, and I know that I have 8 account providers who've been compromised while my data's been in their databases. So I am very conscious of my personal account, and in the end, that led me to actually getting rid of that old email address and just starting again. And it's taken me sort of a year or so to move all my online accounts over as I gradually use them. But eventually that probably becomes something that is a necessity. I've had that account for 10, 15 years before now, and only in the last year or so have I actually changed it over.
Yeah, brilliant. I think that's really good, because I feel like personal accounts, you kind of are you're less on top of them a little bit, but they are just as important as the organizational accounts. Lovely. We've got one last question from Jamie, who has said, can charities get support from the NCSC in the event on a suspected data breach?
So probably this webinar isn't maybe the most reflective of the capacity we have to support all of the charities that may have incidents. I did a little bit of maths actually before this session, which is that according to the cybersecurity breaches survey, which is run by the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, 1 in 5 charities reported in that survey having a cyber incident in the last 12 months. Now, if you extrapolate those figures out to the number of charities in England and Wales, just relying on that regulatory space for now, that's 33,000 charities that we would need to provide this level of support to. So I'm not going to say no, that you can't get support from NCSE, but what I would suggest is report to Action Fraud. That's the one central place for reporting. I think in normal circumstances, we as NCSE probably wouldn't get involved in an incident like this. We'd rely on the ICO and Action Fraud to provide that advice. Our kind of involvement in this one is more specific in that Charities Digital and ourselves work very closely together. And obviously it was me that rung Jonathan to alert him to the email. So this is probably a slightly skewed reflection of the level of support that people can expect to receive, but definitely do report through Action Fraud. And where there is a significant risk to people, we triage those cases and potentially we'll get involved. But primarily the policing route through Action Fraud is your most appropriate reporting mechanism. And
they do have that email address that you've got set up as well,
yes,
that we'll share with everyone afterwards.
Yeah.
We've had great things about that so far, so that is good. Great. Jonathan, I think you have something to say with regards to Scurio, so happy to hand over to you now.
Yeah, it was just because Cub was talking about breach alerts. We actually have a partnership with an organization called Scurio, who do this on kind of a broader scale than through the service Cub mentioned. We, as a result of this partnership, we have a free of charge offer for the very smallest organizations, or organizations with less than 400,000 of income. And then there are other tiered services as well, where it kind of depends on your size. So I think particularly as you get larger, it gets harder to monitor. It's worth considering that. I didn't want to use this call specifically to plug anything, but I guess it was just kind of like, if you want to look at this more deeply and more monitoring tools, we think it's really good. And
yeah, definitely.
It's free if you're under 400k.
Okay, lovely. We'll share that with everyone along with the other resources that you've all shared today. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this, and in such an honest way. We have had a lot of attendees joining us today, so hopefully those attendees that did join got the most out of it. We have a couple of questions left over that are more specific to own examples, so we can have a look at those afterwards and come back to those individually if there is any help that we can supply. But other than that, thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks. Bye, everybody.
Bye.